So, how should I handle or how should you handle your free talk conversation classes between adult, kids, and teens? Hello, teachers! Welcome once again to our vlog. This is TeacherNica, and if you are new to my channel, I would like you to click the subscribe button and the bell button to get notified of our future and previous videos. And if you are still a subscriber of mine, thank you very much for your continuous support. I am very glad to have you once again in this vlog. Now, without further ado, let's begin with our today's video. For today's vlog, we're going to talk about how to have a free talk conversation successfully. Well, as for free talk conversation, these lessons or these classes are usually conducted with an adult student, but there could be possibility or instances where we would teach this to a kid or a teenager. So how should I handle or how should you handle your free talk conversation classes between adult, kids, and teens? Here are some of my tips. Let's have here. First is that you need to check the student's information. Your student's information is very important. Therefore, as a teacher, this can be your guide in having or conducting your classes. Therefore, you will know if you're going to have a casual or let's say a normal lesson, an actual lesson which could be with a textbook or with an actual, let's say, um, article. It could be an article, a textbook, so you will know. Or if it's a free conversation. So that's how important it is to check your student's information. In there, you will see if your student would be an adult, a teen, or a kid. Now, once you identify what level your student is, now identify their speaking skills or their level in terms of English or beginner, intermediate, and advanced students. Now, if you identify their level and you now know your student's level in terms of English proficiency, therefore you can identify what lesson or what topic you will come up with if it's a free conversation. In my future videos, I will talk about those levels of proficiency so that you will have more ideas because it's also important for you to have those ideas in terms of their level in proficiency. Now, after you check your students' information, their level, their age, now check this time your students' previous classes. You're going to check how was the teacher's feedback or the other teacher's feedbacks regarding to that student. What was their feedback? How was the student in class? And what topic they had talked about in that previous discussion or in their previous lessons. Therefore, when you have your student, you will not be redundant in asking information. You're not going to ask the same question as for what the other teacher asked already, and you're not going to have the same conversation once again. Because in that way, the student will have no preparation in terms of what you're going to talk together or what are you going to talk about. That way also, you will help your student improve their speaking skills in an actual conversation manner. Now, after that is you need to, after you check your, let's say, student's background, how they are in the class, now, in an actual situation or in an actual class, when you're in your classroom already and you are already in front of your student and having a free conversation, I usually start with an introduction. Yes, you need to check your students' information because sometimes they will tag there or they are going to put in their students' information that they don't like introduction. So if your student doesn't like introduction, immediately skip that part. Okay? So if the student didn't specify that they don't like introduction, then it's okay to have introduction. Why? Introduction is very helpful not only for you as a teacher but also for your student. In that way, you will know your student. You will understand what are the things they like and what are the things that you could talk about together, what are the similarities that you have. And if they, like for example, in my actual free talk conversation with some of my students, I usually talk or start the introduction first because most of our students are a little bit shy. So it's okay to say it politely to the student that you will be the first person to introduce yourself. For example, you can say, okay, let me start the conversation. I will introduce myself first, then it's your turn afterwards, okay? So then you can state your idea, your introduction. Now, after a short introduction, your student will also introduce him or herself. After that, you will see that we have the same interest when it comes to anime. We have the same interest when it comes to reading books. And now you can talk to each other what kind of books you like, what kind of animes do you like, what is the very famous anime in your country, what do you think is the best anime that you've watched? What is the best book, best author that you think is much more influential for you? That way, you will have conversation now. You have a topic. And it is not the same as the other topics that your student and the other teachers had, because you have that same thing that you have in common, right? You have something in common, you have the same interest. Now, after you introduce, let's say you have skipped that part, you didn't introduce yourself to your student. Now, find something you are common with or same interests. Okay? Let's say your student didn't talk about himself or herself. Go back to the first step. Remember, check your student's information. You can see there their interests, their hobbies. If it is stated, then you could ask your student. I see in your student information or your, let's say, your profile that you like to read books. Now, what kind of books or what genre of literature or books you like to read? Now, you can talk to each other that way. You have the same interest. Well, actually, I also like reading books. That's why I ask you these questions. Okay. Now, by the way, before we proceed to the other, let's say, two other tips that I have, let me remind you that with different let's say proficiency and different age, different ways of approach when it comes to free conversation. Now, why did I say so? Because let's say you're teaching a kid, okay? You're teaching, let's say, a 10-year-old boy, and that 10-year-old boy has the proficiency level of a beginner, let's say like that. So you cannot talk fast, okay? You don't need to talk fast, and you're not, let's say, expected to speak fast and in terms of free conversation with a 10-year-old beginner. Okay, so you're going to have a small conversation or simple talk like, how was your day? What did you do today? And how was school? What did you do to school? You draw. You draw butterfly. Can you say what color of butterfly did you draw? That way you'll have conversation. Simple, but let's say interesting conversation. Avoid being, let's say, boring. Like asking, showing pictures, what color is this, and blah blah blah. You can only do that if it's 5 years old and below. Okay? But if it's 6 years old and above and they're beginner, you can ask on how about their days. How was their day? How was their school? How was their lunch, their dinner, their breakfast? Simple talks, conversation. Now, if let's say your student is a teenager but beginner, you can talk about their interest. But if you're going to talk about their interest, make sure that you talk and have conversation slow. Okay, a little bit slow, not too fast, but just slow. Slow enough that your student can follow the way you speak and the way you share your ideas to them. Okay? And also, if they are beginner, they would love for you to check their grammars. So constantly check their grammars, check their vocabulary words, their choice of words. So those teenagers mostly wants to be corrected, and they are taking your classes as free conversation because they want to improve relating to their academic purposes. So if that's the reason for your student to improve, or let's say that's the reason why your student book your class, make sure that you have a constant correction, a time-to-time correction suggestion towards your students. Now, let's say you have a beginner adult. If you have a beginner adult, usually they could share words or they could share their ideas well, but their vocabularies are a little bit different from what they were actually meant to say. So let's say, be attentive. Yeah, be attentive on the words they choose and their grammar. Same with the teens. And actually, it's more comfortable to talk with adults when when we have free conversation, because you can just jump to another topic related to the next topic and the next topic again without confusion, because adults can actually be much more flexible than kids. Okay? Now, after that, after you find something in common and something interesting with your student, now let's talk about each other's culture. Okay, that's the other suggestion. You could talk with your student about each other's culture, interests in the other culture, their, let's say, idea of your own culture, and you could also tell them about your own culture. And that way, your student will know your culture, and they will also broaden their idea when it comes to other nations, because some other students actually book free conversation because they want to know what your country offers them, because some of them are looking forward on having a vacation in a specific country, and they're looking for what country they should go and have vacation, what should they expect in your city. So you can now tell your student what to expect about your own country. In that way, your student will also learn some of your own culture and tradition, because that's most of the reason why they book free conversation. But keep in mind to check their grammar still and their fluency, of course. And also, they would like to let's say, share their own culture. So it's much better if you know a little bit about their culture. Like, for example, let's say Japanese, your student is Japanese. Now, a little bit of their culture aside from anime. What food do you think they like to eat? What food do you think is very famous in Japan? Or prefecture, rather, what prefecture is famous in Japan? What prefecture do you think is interesting for you? And that way they will also, or they would also like to explain and give you idea in terms of their own perception of their own country, their own prefecture. Okay? Now, let's have here one last tip. You can also, let's say you already talk with the students a lot about their selves, and that student doesn't want to talk about cultures. Now, let's go back to the very basic, I think, very basic question to a free conversation classes is that you're going to ask your student what their ideas about English. For example, why do you want to learn English? Okay, that's the basic question, right? So the student now will share that, oh, I want to learn English because I want to be proficient enough to speak with other country, or let's say other nationalities, foreigners. I would like to be proficient enough to talk with a native speaker, and I think having free conversation would help me with that. Or if the student would say that I don't have the skills in proper introduction, I don't know how to introduce myself to let's say, to someone or to a stranger, someone that I don't know. I have difficulty in introducing myself, and now you know what your student needs, right? So, as you have said, you have difficulties in introducing yourself to a stranger. Now, how about let's do a simple introduction to each other? How do you usually introduce yourself to a stranger you just met. Let's say I am this stranger and you're going to introduce yourself to me. How do you usually introduce yourself? Okay. And that way you will now have a free conversation. Simple as that. Now, if your students say, "Oh, I would just like to talk in English, and I think because I live in, for example, I live in Japan and most of the people here don't speak in English. We speak our language, Nihongo. Therefore, I don't have the time where I could practice actually my skills in English. So I want to improve and maintain my skills in English. That way, you can have conversation. Why? What makes it interesting for you to have or to maintain your English proficiency? Now, you will have conversation. Your student will share their ideas, why they want to maintain it, their reasons, and that way you will have a free conversation all throughout for 25 minutes. So, if all those tips didn't work out, I don't really know what happens to your class. Well, actually, free conversation is the very easy and my favorite class. And actually, free conversation is the time when you can be much more creative in coming up with ideas in topics. But if you really don't have let's say, broad idea information of having a free conversation, I suggest you to check the link down below our description box. This link shows some questions in free conversation. I use this sometimes if, let's say, I'm used with that student and we talk a lot already. We already completed asking introduction. We already talk about something that we have in common. We already talk about English. Now, these are the other questions that you could ask your student. Okay? So I also use this one sometimes. That's why multitasking is very important. So I open this tab and check questions for, let's say, further information that I could ask my students and we could talk about it. Now, free conversation is not as different as it is with the other lesson. You still need to check your students' proficiency when it comes to grammar, intonation, their word choice, their vocabulary, and the way they pronounce the words. Okay, you still need to check those. So, a tip also to not, let's say, to make your student or to have your student book you constantly is that you need to continuously have corrections, suggestions in the chat box. Okay, it's multitasking. You need to type and write the words that need to improve, write the vocabularies or the grammars they should probably use instead of that one. So you can say, as for this one, may I suggest you could say it also like this and send that to the student. That way, your student will be corrected and you can also support your student in improving their proficiency. In the future videos, I would tell you about the proficiency more relating to your students. That way, you will have an idea on how you're going to assess your students. But so far, thank you very much, teachers. Once again, this is Teacher Nika, and do not forget to click the subscribe button and the bell button to get notified of my previous and future videos. See you and have a good day.